Cartoonist Rights Network is the human rights and free speech organization for political cartoonists who find themselves in trouble because of the power and influence of their work. We explained this a couple of years ago when I was up here before, but so much has changed just in the last 10 years or so of monitoring cartoonists in trouble around the world. Can we go to our first slide? By the way, I want to thank all of our Canadian board people. Graham Mackay has been a board member for many years. We thank him very much for his services. Mike Deatter is a board member. Nick Kausar, who I think he's still a Canadian. Nick has been on the board for many years. A lot of people in the audience today are board members. John Lentis here, a board member. Ann Telnis has been a board member and is still a board of advisory member. She gives us lots of good information. And I also have to thank Bruce McKinnon, of course, for his appearance at our last award ceremonies in, I think it was in Florida. It was Bruce McKinnon on the We Only Know One Song All the Way Through band. We really appreciated that, Bruce. Thank you so much. We started Cartoonist Rights Network almost 20 years ago. When I got involved with this cartoonist, I was a contractor working in Sri Lanka, working in community development projects. And I read in a news report that Jeffrey Yunus, this cartoonist, who was then working for the last communist paper in Sri Lanka, had been beaten and stabbed, his house ransacked, his car trashed, all in front of his family. He was in the hospital. And I got in touch with him through the telephone, and I asked him, has anybody helped you? And he said, well, one of the big human rights organizations called me up, and we did a story about it, and the story went out on the wire services, but after that, that was it. And I said, well, if someone were to ask you, what do you want to do? What kind of help do you need? What would you say? And I was expecting something like, oh, let's get an international letter writing campaign and, let the President of the United States get in touch with our president and let's get the United Nations human rights involved. And I was thinking all this big macro action stuff. And he just said, if they kill me, please take care of my children. Please make sure my children have shoes for their feet to go to school, their school fees are paid, and if they put me in the hospital again, could you please make sure somebody pays my hospital bills? I felt dumbfounded. It was just so simple and so obvious and so personal that Jeffrey and I at that moment started Cartoonist Rights Network. We didn't even know what to call it, but we knew that cartoonists around the world needed some form of assistance. The more research I did, I found out that there was no such organization dedicated exclusively to protecting cartoonists in the world at that time. There actually, except for Cartoonist Rights Network, there still isn't today. Other human rights organizations, they also consider, of course, cartoonists are journalists. But when I called them up and asked them, who are your cartoonist clients, there was just this long silence. Not a single one of them could name a cartoonist that they worked with. Anyway, Jeffrey and I got started on Cartoonist Rights Network. Next slide, please. He got into trouble because of this and other cartoons. President Premadasa was well known for being a friend of churches and covilles and Buddhist monasteries. He would go around the country giving flowers and grants of money to all the religious organizations, but at the same time there was a student insurrection taking place in the country, and there were thousands, I think the final number was something like 4,000 or 5,000, of young Sinhalese students and young people who had been rounded up at night, interrogated until death, and their bodies put on the tires. At night. Necklacing the bodies was a common practice. The only thing left in the morning were the steel cables inside the tires that had burned out and human teeth. Human teeth was the only thing left for 4,000 or 5,000 young people. So when Jeffrey started fooling around with the President's Association with these things, he was beaten. Next slide, please. Freedom House is an awfully good source of information on free speech in the world. This is their annual free speech and freedom of expression map. The green is the good guys, the yellow is the middle guys, and I think the purple, I think that's the way it goes up there. The purple are the bad guys. It's interesting to note the United States, although we're still coming out green, has slipped significantly lower on the green list because of actions of local police departments over the last, one or 2 years with the Occupy movement arrests. Many journalists have been arrested by local police chiefs during the Occupy movements, and that has brought the United States downwards on the free speech list by most of the organizations that take this measure. Cartoonists, you all know Daryl Cagle. Susie Cagle was arrested in Oakland. She was taken to jail, put in the slammer, released the next day. Charges against her to date have never been dropped, despite letters from us, from Committee to Protect Journalists, from the interactions of other legal organizations trying to point out to the mayor of Oakland that a police chief is not empowered to decide who does and doesn't enjoy First Amendment protections. However, this is happening all over the United States now, where local police chiefs are issuing press passes that they recognize only press passes issued by the police, not press passes by any newspapers or wire services or any other legitimate organizations. We'll feel this is another slow, quiet encroachment on the First Amendment. Next slide, please. Traditionally, the kind of human rights abuses before the 12 Danish cartoons and before 9/11 were issues very much like Jonathan Shapiro, what was Zapiro in South Africa, was caught up in. Jacob Zuma was then the vice president of the ANC party and the president, hopefully the president-elect in the next elections. Zuma was in trouble even though he was the vice president at the time under Thabo Mbeki and the vice president of the ANC. He was indicted for rape, raping a local neighbor girl, and he was also indicted for fiscal mismanagement. Wonderful guy to have as a heir apparent to the presidency to follow, in the footsteps of Nelson Mandela. Jonathan always drew him with a little shower head on his head because during his trial for rape, they asked him, "Didn't you know that the girl you were raping was HIV positive?" And he said, "Oh, yes, I knew." "Well, weren't you taking any protections to save yourself from HIV?" No. You see, all you have to do is take a shower afterwards. So here's the next president of South Africa telling the judge that all he had to do was take a shower to cure himself of any infection of HIV. And of course, Jonathan just ran with it. So even today, Mr. Zuma, who's now the president of the country, is always shown by Jacob as somebody with a shower head over his head. In this one, his henchmen, the other political parties that support the ANC, all came out with very critical statements about the newspaper articles about Zuma that were critical of his court cases. So they were saying things in public like, you're never going to criticize our man when he gets to be the president. All these journalists should be rounded up and shot. And, they were making all these comments that free speech in South Africa was a thing of the past. So Jonathan did this cartoon showing, Zuma had raped somebody, so there you are. Raping Lady Justice, while all these other henchmen were holding her down. Oh, go ahead, what does it say? Go ahead, go for it, boss. Then there was a firestorm in the newspapers. You can't say that. We all love justice. We like the courts. We're not against free speech and everything like that. We love everything. As a point to counter Jonathan's cartoon. Next cartoon. So Jonathan just fought right back. It's none of this back away stuff. He just went for it. He knows damn well they're all liars. In the meantime, between this cartoon and the next time, Next cartoon, Zuma had to go to court. The court upheld, they squashed his appeal for taking his financial case out of court. In other words, he was confirmed by the High Court that he was still in trouble and he still had to go back to court again. Next cartoon. Lenny Justice kicked him right in the right place and got away free. Jonathan is sued for $500,000 by Jacob Zuma. Even though Jacob Zuma is now the president, he still has a court case out against Jonathan. This is the kind of case we work with all the time. It's a head of state or a government coming down on a cartoonist and charging the cartoonist with some form of insult. These were insult laws left over by the colonial masters, and as soon as the colonial masters were finished using them, the new regimes picked up these same insult laws and found that they were just as useful to keep their opposition at bay as well. The new kind of cases we're involved with now, can I have the next slide? Actually, the cases we're involved with mostly now, of course, do involve cases of, what do we call it, against Islam, insult to Islam, insulting the Prophet, insult of Islam, causing, where's this coming from? Causing riots. The riots would be a mob of people going after cartoonists for drawing a cartoon about the Prophet, and of course the cartoonist is arrested, not the mob. This is happening all over. This cartoonist did this illustrated book on the life of the Prophet Muhammad. It's really strong stuff. It's supposed to be taken right from the Quran and from other holy writings from the time of the Prophet. It's really strong stuff. Next slide, please. Let's see what goes on here. In India right now, there is a tremendous discussion going on in the Lok Sabha, which is their parliament, to ban all political cartoons forever from primary and secondary school textbooks. This 40-year-old cartoon was resurrected and put into a contemporary textbook. At that time, they were rewriting the Constitution, and this cartoonist was making a comment on how slow the rewrite of the Constitution was taking. This issue was a big thing back 40 years ago, but when it appeared in a textbook, it was a big thing now as well. So the book editors are in trouble, the textbook writers are in trouble, and I listened to about a 1.5 hour interview on television. The interviewer was interviewing four people, a cartoonist, a textbook publisher, and 2 politicians, and for half an hour they railed at each other, screaming at each other over this cartoon, when the words freedom of the press or freedom of expression was never mentioned once in that half hour of railing back and forth against each other. So for an entire government to be considering banning cartoons at a certain level is something new in what we find in terms of actions against cartoons, and in this case, cartoonists. Next slide, please. This fellow, I'm going to read you what we have on our website about this Indonesian lad. It's just a short paragraph. On June 13th, 2012, 32-year-old Indonesian civil servant Alexander An was convicted of disseminating information aimed at inciting religious hatred under Article blah, blah, blah of Indonesia's Electronic Information and Transaction Law. He was then sentenced to 30 months in prison and fined about $10,000. Alex was initially arrested after a mob assaulted him for openly declaring his atheism online and for posting articles and panels of a comic strip critical of the Prophet. That was the book strip that you saw in the last panel. After explaining to the police why he had been attacked, Alex was charged under Article blah 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 of the Indonesian Penal Code with blasphemy and persuading others to embrace atheism. So this fellow is a blogger, he's not a cartoonist. He brought a cartoon into his blog that was deemed offensive. He declared himself an atheist, and he got a double whammy of bringing in a Muslim cartoon and declaring himself an atheist. And this guy's going to be in prison for the foreseeable future. He's not even a cartoonist. Now, he probably illegally, he snatched a cartoon somewhere, and he probably didn't pay any money to the other cartoonist. That's also happening on these blog situations, as you all know. I'm just back from Tunisia a couple of weeks ago, and a young Tunis blogger who brought in a Prophet Muhammad cartoon onto his blog was just given 7 years in jail as a blogger for showing a blasphemous cartoon. Okay. I'm going to turn this over to Nick Kauser now. In other words, we had an entirely different kind of cartoonist in trouble years ago. Now, as the cyberspace is becoming the critical channel of communications, things are changing very rapidly for cartoonists and now bloggers as well. Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you.